when Judge Franklin Pierce summoned Emma Lawson to his courtroom. He believed he was about to put a presumptuous schoolteacher in her place, a woman who had dared to challenge his authority in public. He intended to humiliate her, strip her of credibility, and reaffirm his dominance. But, as Emma stood calmly before him, dressed in a burgundy sweater, her notes clutched tightly in one hand, the judge had no idea that the trap he set for her would become the very snare that unraveled him. That same morning, in room 212 of Westridge High, Emma Lawson stood before her senior literature class. She scrawled symbolism in modern literature across the whiteboard in neat cursive. The students sat in varying degrees of attentions, some absorbed, others visibly waiting for the lunch bell. It was Emma's 10th year at the school, and though she faced the usual frustrations, she still found deep joy in teaching. A voice from the back broke her rhythm. "Miss Lawson," Jeremy called out, "why do we even have to break down symbolism? Can't we just enjoy the story?" Emma turned, smiling warmly. "That's actually a very thoughtful question, Jeremy. Stories aren't just for fun. They show U.S. justice, truth, and the human condition. The more we unpack them, the more we see not just the story, but everything around us." As the bell rang and students began to file out, Emma noticed a folded copy of the school paper on one of the desks. The bold headline caught her eye. "Controversial ruling by local judge affects education budget." Her smile faded. She remembered that community meeting, where she'd spoken firmly against a recent court decision, one that had shifted public education funds to benefit a private development initiative. The man behind the ruling, Judge Franklin Pierce. Later in the staff lounge, her co-worker Diane raised an eyebrow as she sipped her coffee. "Heard you stirred things up pretty good at that meeting." Emma gave a small shrug. "I just said what was right. What he did may have been within the law, but it wasn't right. That money was meant for schools." "Well, you definitely made some enemies," Diane warned. "Judge Pierce has powerful friends. You should be careful." "I'm just a teacher," Emma replied, collecting her things. "What's he going to do? Drag me into court for having an opinion?" What Emma never shared openly was that she hadn't always planned on being a teacher. Years ago, she'd graduated with top honors from law school. But after witnessing the cynical power plays during her internships, she'd turned away from that world. Instead, she chose to teach, to help students develop sharp ethical minds. She saw literature as a quiet kind of justice. As she drove home that evening, her thoughts drifted to her late grandfather, a small-town lawyer who had championed the powerless. His memory lived in the well-thumbed law books that now filled a shelf in her apartment, a reminder of a path she could have taken. Once home, Emma kicked off her shoes, intending to spend the evening grading papers. But the blinking red light on her answering machine interrupted the calm. "Miss Lawson," came a stiff voice. "This is the clerk from the municipal court. You are required to appear this Friday at 9 a.m. regarding a recent traffic violation. Judge Franklin Pierce will be presiding." Emma's brow furrowed. A traffic violation. She recalled getting a small ticket weeks earlier for rolling through a stop sign, but she'd already paid the fine online. There should have been no reason to appear. A faint ripple of unease passed through her. She remembered the way Judge Pierce had looked at her at the town meeting, sharp, assessing, like a man who didn't forget. She opened her laptop and double-checked the confirmation email. Payment completed. So why summon her? The question lingered like a chill draft. Across town, in chambers soaked in status-polished wood, leather-bound volumes, and heavy gold-framed certificates, Judge Pierce was flipping through a folder with Emma Lawson's name on it. A thin smile tugged at his mouth. "Gerald," he called to his clerk. "I want everything on this woman, every file, every scrap." The teacher, Emma Lawson. The clerk, uneasy, nodded. He'd worked with the judge long enough to know what came next when someone crossed him. The summons for the traffic violation had been processed just as Pierce had asked. "Very good," Pierce said, reclining in his chair, fingers pressed together in thought. "She really thought she could embarrass me in public. Like I'm some petty bureaucrat." Gerald cleared his throat. "It was a community forum, sir. People are allowed to speak their minds." Pierce's eyes sharpened. It wasn't what she said, Gerald, it was how. She laid out statutes, cited precedent, challenged the interpretation. She made me look like a fool. And in front of half the town, no less. He snapped the file shut with force. A high school teacher, she has no idea who she's dealing with. What had truly unsettled the judge was how calm and informed she'd been, unlike the usual parade of irate residents making emotional appeals. Emma had been precise, confident, and persuasive. She'd sounded like someone who knew the law. Fine everything, he repeated. Education, employment, friends. I want to know what she eats for breakfast. Later that day, Gerald returned with a slim folder. There's not much, sir. She's lived here for years, teaches at Westridge High, never married, no criminal record, keeps to herself. He hesitated before adding, but she did attend law school, graduated top of her class 15 years ago. Didn't sit for the bar though. Pierce's eyes widened. A law graduate. He leaned back, absorbing the detail. Then, slowly, a smirk spread across his face, one of satisfaction, laced with fresh strategy. Now, it all made sense. She wasn't just a schoolteacher. She was trained to think like an attorney. And that made her more dangerous than he'd realized. But also, perhaps, more fun to destroy. Asterisk, asterisk. She knows just enough to be dangerous, Pierce said coolly, but not enough to defend herself properly. He turned toward the window where dark clouds had begun to gather. Gerald, amend the summons. Change it from a paid traffic violation to a failure to appear for a scheduled court hearing. Add a contempt charge as well. Gerald hesitated, his face pale. Sir, that would be falsifying a record. The law grants judges a certain degree of discretion. Gerald, Pierce interrupted sharply. This is about setting an example. She's a schoolteacher who thinks her opinion matters in legal affairs. A fine, or some light community service, nothing severe. Just enough to remind her of her place. Maybe even a little stain on her record to keep her from meddling again. Gerald reluctantly nodded. He, like many others in town, knew how far the judge's influence reached. Judge Franklin Pierce was deeply embedded in the town's power, structure, and few were willing to challenge his authority, even when his actions blurred ethical lines. Most people simply paid their fines, unwilling to fight a system so clearly rigged against them. That night, Judge Pierce dined with several influential local figures, including the school district superintendent. Over wine and roasted lamb, Pierce brought up the topic of certain teachers becoming a little too involved in public discourse. He swirled his glass, adding casually, "There's one in particular, Ma Lawson. She seems to believe educators have a role in challenging the justice system. That sends a dangerous message to students, don't you think?" The superintendent, aware that school budgets often depended on judicial cooperation, nodded quickly. "I'll follow up on that right away." "I'm sure it's nothing major," Pierce said, smiling smoothly. "Still, teachers should teach, not interfere with the judiciary." The groundwork had been laid. By the time Emma set foot in his courtroom, the damage would already be spreading fabricated charges paired with professional consequences. She was being boxed in from all sides. Meanwhile, at Westridge High, a faculty meeting had just ended. When Principal Stevens asked Emma to stay behind, his face was uncharacteristically stern. "Emma," he began, removing his glasses and rubbing the bridge of his nose, "I received a call from the superintendent yesterday. Apparently, you're involved in some kind of legal matter." Emma blinked, genuinely confused. "Legal matter? You mean the traffic ticket? I already paid that online." Stevens slid a paper across his desk. "That's not what I heard. The superintendent mentioned a failure to appear, and contempt of court." Judge Pierce himself raised concerns about educators showing a lack of respect for legal institutions. Emma stared at the document, her stomach tightening. "That doesn't make any sense. I paid the fine and got a confirmation email. I never received anything about appearing in court." "I hope that's true," Stevens replied, clearly uncomfortable. "Because this could become a contract issue if things get worse." The superintendent hinted as much. Emma felt the chill of realization. This is retaliation, she said slowly. It's about what I said at the town hall meeting. Stevens didn't respond. He didn't have to. Later that afternoon, Emma found a new envelope in her mailbox. This wasn't the automated citation she'd received weeks ago. This was a formal court order charging her with failure to appear and contempt. She was expected in front of Judge Pierce in 3 days. Her hands shook as she dialed the court clerk's office. "I'm sorry, Ms. Lawson," the clerk said curtly, "but the records show you were notified to appear last Friday in relation to the violation. When you didn't, the judge issued a contempt charge." "But I was never notified," Emma protested. "I paid the fine. I even have the receipt." The system flagged the payment due to one moment, an irregularity in processing, the clerk said. "You'll need to resolve this directly with the court." That evening, Emma climbed into her closet and pulled down a heavy box coated in dust. Inside were her grandfather's legal notebooks, worn textbooks, and files from his years as a defense attorney. Then she opened her laptop and started digging into Judge Pierce's record. Patterns emerged quickly. The same real estate developers, the same financial firms, repeatedly won favorable judgments in his courtroom. No complaints against him ever. Reached a disciplinary review. Not one in 6 years. Emma's phone rang. It was Diane, a fellow teacher. "Emma, something strange is going on. Stevens is asking around about your classroom discussions. Like whether you talk about politics." Emma felt her jaw clench. "Pierce is behind this." She ended the call and looked down at her hands. They were no longer trembling. The fear had given way to something sharper. Focus. Pierce had overstepped. He'd mistaken her for someone easy to scare. But he'd made a fatal miscalculation. "This isn't just about me," she muttered, pulling her grandfather's old leather-bound volume on judicial ethics toward her. She sat cross-legged on the floor, hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, surrounded by highlighted printouts and opened case files. Pierce had done this before. She circled notes in red. A journalist had criticized him in an editorial 3 years ago, and was soon audited by the county. An attorney who challenged his ruling last year suddenly found himself reported for professional misconduct. Emma leaned back against the wall, determination settling in her chest like armor. "You want a lesson, Judge Pierce?" she whispered. "Let's begin. Asterisk, asterisk." The moment Emma questioned Judge Pierce's decision, the retaliation began disguised, subtle, and dangerous. Bar complaints surfaced vague, baseless, yet enough to rattle anyone without the means to defend themselves. Most people gave in, paid fines, issued apologies. Few dared to fight. Pierce knew how to apply pressure just enough to avoid suspicion. Emma's phone buzzed. A message from Diane. "Stevens wants to observe your class tomorrow. Something about curriculum." The timing was no coincidence. The screws were tightening. Emma paced her apartment, her thoughts a carousel of legal tactics. If she resisted, her job could be on the line. If she gave in, she'd be endorsing an abuse of authority. Her gaze drifted to the photo of her grandfather on the shelf. "What would you do?" she whispered. She reached for his old journal-faded leather, bursting with courtroom notes from decades past. A brittle newspaper clipping slid out. Her grandfather, arms folded beside townsfolk who'd unseated a corrupt city official. His words echoed, "You don't beat power with more power. You beat it with truth and readiness." That night, Emma made 3 calls. One to a classmate at the state bar, another to a former student, now an investigative reporter, and the last to the court clerk's office, to confirm she'd be representing herself. The following morning, she stood before her class with steady hands and clear intent, even as Principal Stevens lingered silently at the back. He scribbled something as she spoke passionately about to kill a mockingbird, about the cost of integrity in the face of authority. After class, he approached Emma about the court situation. "Maybe it's wiser just to apologize to Judge Pierce. These things can spiral." She gave a calm smile. "Thank you, but I believe our students need to see what it looks like when someone stands up, even when it's hard." As he walked away, she tucked a discreet recorder into her bag and returned to reviewing her notes. Judge Pierce had assumed he'd cornered a naive teacher who didn't know the game. What he didn't know was that she'd studied it more closely than he ever imagined, and she had nothing left to lose. Over the next 2 days, Emma immersed herself in preparation. She took a personal day from school, not quite a lie, as she was both lawyer and client in this battle. At the county law library, she combed through pages of legal precedent. Mrs. Finch, the elderly librarian, noticed. "Been a while since anyone studied like that," she said, guiding Emma to a reference on contempt hearings. Emma smiled. "My grandfather used to say real legal work happens in books, not on screens." Mrs. Finch tilted her head. "You're not with the bar, are you?" "I know most of them. I'm a teacher," Emma replied. "But this calls for precision." Later, she visited the Public Records Office to pull transcripts from the judge's past contempt rulings. The clerk looked curious. Not the usual request for someone representing herself. "I believe in doing my homework," Emma said. Evenly back home, she built a timeline. The ticket, her payment receipt, the ghost notifications she never received, and the town hall meeting where she'd voiced criticism. It was a fragile thread, but it suggested retaliation. Then her phone rang. "Miss Lawson, it's Mark." Her former student's voice was low but urgent. "I looked into Pierce's record. His contempt citations, they've spiked 400% since he took the bench, and they mostly target people who've challenged him. Not enough for state scrutiny, but definitely fishy." "Can you get me names?" she asked. "Already sent. Just be careful. He's tied in with the county exec, half the school board, to D.O." After hanging up, Emma adjusted her strategy. A direct accusation wouldn't stick, not without hard evidence. But procedural inconsistencies in her own case, that was a crack. She could work into something larger. That evening, she chose her courtroom outfit with care, modest, neutral. No aggressive lines, no suggestion she was anything but a concerned citizen. She needed to stay underestimated. She practiced her opening statement over and over, walking the fine line between respect and resolve. She packed her grandfather's old briefcase with neatly sorted documents, everything from receipt printouts to legal statutes, and between her notes, she slipped a sealed envelope contingency plans she hoped she wouldn't need. Her grandfather's voice lingered in her memory. In court, the best weapon is being more prepared than they ever expect, and this time, Emma Lawson was ready. Asterisk, asterisk. Emma finally went to bed that night with an odd sense of peace. Tomorrow wouldn't just be about defending herself against baseless allegations, it would be about confronting the misuse of authority. It was the very principle she tried to instill in her students, that literature often echoed real-life struggles for justice. Win or lose, she was going to face Judge Pierce on her own terms, not his. By morning, the municipal courthouse was alive with its usual chaos. Lawyers juggled paperwork, clerks called out names, and nervous defendants waited for their cases to be heard. Emma sat silently at the back of the courtroom, watching Judge Pierce preside over earlier matters. His behavior followed a familiar rhythm, short-tempered with defendants, overly courteous to prosecutors, and dismissive of explanations. He handed down decisions rapidly, rarely referencing legal codes. What troubled Emma most was how often he interrupted individuals representing themselves before they could finish a thought. She caught sight of Gerald, the clerk she had spoken to on the phone. He seemed uneasy, avoiding eye contact and shifting in his seat whenever the judge delivered especially severe rulings. Then her name was called, Docket 47B. Lawson, Emma. Failure to appear and contempt of court. Gerald's voice sounded strained. Emma rose and walked to the front, placing her late grandfather's briefcase on the table. She could feel the eyes in the room turning to her. Judge Pierce barely glanced up from her file, his face set in bored detachment. "Miss Lawson," he said, his voice thick with superiority, "you stand accused of failing to appear in court concerning a traffic violation TR2, 02, 45, 89, and are further charged with contempt. How do you plead? Not guilty, Your Honor, Emma answered steadily. I believe there's been some confusion, and I'd like to explain. Pierce arched an eyebrow. The facts are straightforward. Miss Lawson, you were notified to appear on October 15th, and didn't. As a result, this court issued a contempt charge. Your Honor, if I may, Emma said, I never received any notice for an appearance on that date. I received a citation on October 1st, which I paid online by October 3rd. I have the receipt here. She handed the document to the clerk, who gave it to the judge. Pierce skimmed it with little interest. Paying the fine doesn't remove your obligation to appear, he said. The citation would have informed you that a court date was required. With respect, Your Honor, it did not, Emma replied, pulling out the original citation. There's no mention of a court date anywhere, and when I paid online, the system indicated that the matter was resolved. A flicker of irritation crossed his face. Miss Lawson, perhaps you're used to steering conversations in your classroom, he said sharply, but in this courtroom, I determine what constitutes proper procedure. His tone dripped with contempt, and even a few lawyers exchanged glances at his attitude. I understand, Emma said calmly. However, procedural due process requires that a person be properly notified before being held in contempt. May I request to see the notice I supposedly received? The judge's jaw clenched subtly. Things weren't going the way he'd expected. She wasn't intimidated. She wasn't backing down. Proceed with caution, Miss Lawson, he warned. Questioning this court's methods will only worsen your situation. Pierce leaned closer, visibly irritated. The room had grown noticeably quieter. Even nearby attorneys had stopped talking to follow what was unfolding. Let me be absolutely clear, he said, voice louder. The court has documentation showing that notice was sent. Whether or not you received it is irrelevant. Emma kept her composure. Understood. Still, could I please see proof that it was actually delivered? The judge motioned to Gerald. Mr. Gerald, provide the standard notification record. Gerald hesitated before fumbling through the files and handing over a form. Emma examined it closely. Your Honor, she said. This form is dated October 10th, but it lacks a signature. From a process server, there's also no certified mail receipt. As far as I can tell, there's no evidence it was ever sent. A vein pulsed in Pierce's jaw. Are you accusing the court of falsifying documents, Miss Lawson? Not at all, she replied evenly. I'm only stating that according to Municipal Court Rule 7.3, proof of actual delivery is required before contempt charges can be applied. This doesn't meet that standard. The judge's face darkened. People shifted in their seats, growing uncomfortable. Miss Lawson, your self-taught interpretation of the law is wearing thin, Pierce snapped. It's clear you struggle with authority. Your inappropriate remarks at last month's town hall meeting are evidence enough. And there it was, the connection she had suspected he would eventually bring into the open. She noticed a reporter in the back, furiously scribbling in a notepad. I wasn't aware that my right to speak at a public forum had any bearing on a traffic matter, Your Honor, Emma replied coolly. You see, this attitude is exactly the issue, he barked. This court finds you in contempt. You are fined $2,000 and sentenced to 40 hours of community service. He slammed the gavel, expecting the matter to be done. Emma remained calm. Your Honor, I'd like to file a motion. This case is closed, Miss Lawson, Pierce snapped. A motion for judicial recusal is always timely, she continued. According to Rule 2.11 of the Judicial Conduct Code, a judge should recuse himself when his impartiality is in question. The room froze. Silence swept across the courtroom. Judge Pierce stared at her, visibly thrown off. And what grounds could you possibly have much to say? Emma opened her briefcase. I'll be glad to explain. Emma stood tall, her hands resting gently on the briefcase that once belonged to her grandfather. The courtroom was silent, every eye focused on the quiet, composed teacher who had dared to confront one of the county's most feared judges. Your Honor, she began, her voice steady and unwavering. I respectfully request your recusal on 3 distinct grounds. She opened a folder she had prepared in advance. First, she said, there is a clear suggestion of partiality. You openly linked these proceedings to my speech at the recent town hall, which is constitutionally protected. That implies this. Case might be motivated by retaliation. Judge Pierce's face darkened. Miss Lawson, you are approaching dangerous territory. Emma didn't flinch. Second, she continued, there are procedural inconsistencies that cannot be ignored. She held up a document. According to the court's online records, my citation was marked as resolved on October 3rd. Yet 6 days later, after I publicly criticized your decision, the case status was changed to appearance required. I was never informed. She turned slightly, addressing the gallery as well. Public records show that in the past year, not one other paid citation has had its status manually altered after resolution. A wave of murmurs filled the room. The court reporter's fingers flew across her keyboard. Emma reached into her briefcase again. Third, I've collected data from 7 other cases where individuals faced contempt charges or unusual legal consequences after disagreeing with you publicly. The judge slammed his gavel. That's enough, you're out of line. Emma didn't raise her voice. This brings me to my third point. Judicial ethics rule to point to clearly states, a judge must not allow personal, political, financial, or social interests to affect judicial conduct. If you won't step down, I'm ready to file a formal complaint. To the Judicial Conduct Committee, I've gathered statements from 3 defendants and evidence of a consistent misuse of power. The courtroom buzzed with disbelief. Lawyers were scribbling notes. A reporter sat frozen, his jaw slack. Judge Pierce's face had drained of color. Miss Lawson, he said carefully, where did you learn the law? Emma allowed herself a soft smile. Before becoming a literature teacher, I earned my law degree from the State University with top honors. I chose a different path, but I never stopped learning. My grandfather always told me, knowing the law is a citizen's best defense. She laid her hands flat on the table. I'm submitting my motion formally. Documented irregularities, evidence of a bias pattern. And I intend to appeal immediately under the collateral order doctrine if the motion is denied. The judge looked at her, realization sinking in. What he thought would be a show of dominance had turned into a trap of his own making. The courtroom held its breath as he stared at Emma. Then finally declared a 15-minute recess. Behind closed doors, his tone had changed entirely. What do you want? He asked, tension behind his words. Justice, Emma answered firmly. Drop the fabricated charges. Dismiss them with prejudice. And step away from any case involving me or Westridge. Hi. She handed over a list of other cases that deserved review. When the court reconvened, Judge Pierce announced in a tight voice that all charges against Emma were dismissed with prejudice and that he would recuse himself from any future proceedings related to her to avoid the appearance of bias. Outside, a reporter caught up with Emma. Care to share a comment? She smiled calmly. The system works best when everyone judges, included, respects the rights of the people. 2 weeks later, as Emma led a discussion on To Kill a Mockingbird, her principal and the superintendent entered the classroom. After class, the principal approached her. I should have supported you, he said, regret in his voice. You were in a tough spot, Emma replied, with grace. The superintendent added, Judge Pierce is on leave, and our school's funding has been restored. That evening, Emma discovered an old photo of her grandfather in law school, newly framed with a note signed by her students. Thank you for showing us that standing up for what's right truly matters. She traced the photo gently, her fingers brushing the spines of her grandfather's old law books. Maybe, she thought, education really was the surest path to justice.